I feel like I should say something about my title slide here, being that I'm actually at San Diego State giving this talk. All of my talks start with this slide, with having Hefner Hall as the background, regardless of the title and where I am. And I do that in part because I'm really proud to be a faculty member at San Diego State, promoting research at San Diego State. And also because this is such a beautiful, iconic image of California, that it will entice students and collaborators to San Diego. So what I want to do today is share with you some examples of what the study of sign languages can tell us about the nature of human language and about the brain. And I'm going to start by just giving you a flavor of sign languages around the world. So the first example up here is a signer using American Sign Language to give a short lecture about the structure of the brain. This other example here is actually from the Netherlands. It's part of a very large corpus study being conducted by Ono Krasborn. It's an older woman telling a fairy tale in sign language of the Netherlands. And this project is looking at how language differs across generations, what kind of dialectical variation there is across the Netherlands, and it's really using this corpus for linguistic and sociolinguistic research. The example down here with the little boy is actually from my colleagues Diane Little-Martin and Ronici Quadros. This is from Libras, or Brazilian Sign Language, and they're studying how sign languages are acquired in different countries and how different sign languages are acquired. And he's basically, his parents are deaf, and he's telling them about his day at school. And then the final examples here are basically from linguistics articles. So linguists who are studying different languages around the world, in all linguistics papers, you give examples from the language that you're studying, and these are taken from DVDs and CDs of linguistic examples, looking at how sign languages vary across the world, what's similar, basically sign language typology. And so what I'd like to do is raise some questions about what the study of sign languages in all of its forms and the study of deaf and hearing people who use them have to tell us. So one of the things that studying sign languages tell us is what's really universal to all human languages. So you can't make statements about what's common to all languages without looking at sign languages. And I would argue that theories that can account for both signed and spoken languages are to be preferred over theories that really only focus or account for spoken language data, or theories that only account for sign language data. Sign languages can tell us about what aspects of human language are shaped by their perceptual systems, by audition versus vision. So for example, we know that the auditory system is very good at fast temporal changes, 40 milliseconds. And so spoken languages tend to have a lot of linear structure, lots of segments, lots of morphemes or meaning units that can be combined in a linear structure. Sign languages, on the other hand, vision is very good at taking information in simultaneously. So sign languages tend to have a lot more simultaneous structure. For example, you can have information conveyed linguistically on the face at the same time as you're producing signs. Looking at sign languages also tells us how languages are shaped by their output systems. So sign languages are produced by the hands, movements in space. You can see the articulators in comparison to speech, where you can't see the articulators. The tongue is inside the mouth. And it turns out that these have interesting implications for the nature of signs. So there are signs that can look like actions, for example, like brush hair. It's hard to make a word look like an action or sound like an action. You can do it, but it's much more reduced than in sign languages. These properties also have an effect on how we talk about spatial relationships, something I'm quite interested in. You can place the hands in space. It works very differently than for spoken languages. And these result from the sort of input-output mechanisms of speech versus sign. So what I want to do is I'm going to raise sort of three questions that come about by thinking about sign languages. And I've selected these questions because they can really show how sign language can be a useful tool in understanding about the brain bases for language and the nature of language. So the first question I want to ask is just, do all human languages represent meaning that is semantics independently from form or phonology? Then the second question we'll be looking at is this relationship between language and pantomime. When language looks like pantomime, how does the brain tell the difference between the two? And then finally, this question about how the biology of language expression, how that might affect the neural substrates, the neural bases for spatial language. Okay, so let's start with the first question. And the reason that this question comes up is because of something called iconicity, the fact that signs often look like or have some relationship to their meaning. I'll give you some examples. Okay, so these are from American Sign Language. So the first one, the sign for hairbrush, looks very much like brushing your hair. Okay. The sign for ball looks like the shape of a ball. The sign for Scotland sort of reflects this sort of typical plaid scarf that is associated with Scotsmen. Okay. And then the sign for the mind or the brain, you're pointing to the mind or the brain. Okay. Now, because form is very often not independent of the meaning, does this lead to sort of fundamental differences in the way that meaning and form are represented compared to spoken languages? Okay. So one question is, are semantics and form really kind of conflated or the same in sign languages because of this iconicity? And if that's the case, then there's an interesting prediction, which is that signers should not experience what's called, or the equivalent of a tip of the tongue experience. How many of you have heard of know what a tip of the tongue have heard of that? Yeah, pretty much everybody. So it's the idea that you know the word you want, you retrieve the semantics, but you can't get at the form of the word. Okay, so we'll see if we can kind of get a phenomenological experience here, at least from some of you. We'll see if we can get you to experience a tip of the tongue. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture with a definition, and you have to come up with a word. Now, if you know what it is, don't say it. Okay, keep it to yourselves, just in case your neighbor is in a TOT. Okay, because your neighbor can't quite get what the word is, and if you say it, then they'll get it. So let's just see if we can induce a TOT experience. You know what that is? Anybody? Almost got it? You got? You're feeling it? We'll relieve the pressure. Periscope. So often you'll know maybe the beginning of the word. You'll feel like it's got more than one syllable, but you won't be able to get the actual form of the word, even though you know exactly what it is. It turns out that these TOT experiences are much more common with proper nouns, with names of people and places. So I'm going to try one more time. Again, I'm going to show you a picture of a famous person. If you know who it is, don't say it. And if you don't, see if you are in a TOT kind of state. Anybody kind of like, who is that? I kind of know who it is. Often you'll know something all about the person. You'll know that she was nominated for an Academy Award. She didn't win this year, but she won earlier for As Good as It Gets. She was in this famous TV show. Helen Hunt is who this is. Okay. So again, for spoken languages, these data from tip of the tongue experiences have been used to show that in spoken language production, there's a separation. There's a two-stage process in retrieving a word. That you first can retrieve the semantics, the meaning, and then you retrieve the form. So TOTs show that by retrieving one part, but not the other part, not the form. So our question was, do signers experience what we call the tip of the finger state in parallel to tip of the tongue, right? And the question is interesting because if you have this conflation between semantics and form, you shouldn't have a tip of the tongue, because once you get the meaning, you should get the form, because they're so intimately entwined. And so we conducted two studies. One was simply a diary study, where we just had signers keep track. Did they ever have this feeling of knowing, this feeling that, oh, I know the sign that I want, but I can't retrieve it? Did they ever have that experience? And they kept a diary for about a year. And we also did a more experimental study where we tried to elicit these tip of the finger states parallel to the way experimenters have done it with spoken languages, where we, a little bit like what I did here with you guys, show you a picture or a definition and you have to give me the word. So in this case, we had a translation task where they were given proper names in English and had to give me the ASL proper sign. So we could sort of see, we could probe tip of the fingers. Okay. So first for the diary study, we found that all signers reported this feeling. So signers did experience this tip of the feeling. So they knew the sign, but they weren't able to retrieve what the form of the sign was. Interestingly enough, they occurred at about the same rate that we see TOTs for spoken languages. Now, if there's this conflation of meaning and form, they should be much rarer in sign languages, but they occurred at about the same rate. About once a week, people would have this kind of feeling. Now, one of the things we know about tip of the tongue experiences is that often you'll get some information, right? And the most common type of information that speakers will get is the beginning. You know it starts with a B, or you know what the first syllable is, or something like that. And what that's telling us is that in speech production, there's something very salient or accessible about the onsets of words. So our question was, what about sign languages? Do we find the same sort of partial retrieval of form information? Okay. And so this is where the elicitation study helped, because in the diary study, it was sort of difficult to write down what you knew about the sign you were getting. But in the elicitation study, when we presented someone with a proper noun to give us the sign, and they indicated they were in this very frustrating tip of the finger state, we could say, well, do you know what the hand shape is? Do you know what the location is? Do you know what the movement of the sign is? And so we could find out what parts of the sign, if any, could they retrieve. And it turns out that signers did report partial information. And this is one example where she was trying to produce, or they were trying to recall the sign for Scotland. And what the signer did was something like this. Okay, so they knew the hand shape, they knew this movement, but they couldn't get the location on the shoulder. That was what took them a while to get. And when we measured what aspects of sign were retrieved, this group of features, the location, the orientation, and the hand shape, were all retrieved about equally. I actually had my money on hand shape. I thought hand shape would be something that they were able to recall, in part because sign language dictionaries are organized by hand shape. There's something cognitively salient about hand shape. But hand shape is not the onset, is not by itself the beginning of a sign. It's this bundle, location, orientation. These are perceived roughly simultaneously when you're understanding a sign. And so you can think of them as the onset of the sign. What unfolds over time is the movement. And that was the feature that was least recalled in these TOF experiences. And so what that tells us is that parallel to spoken language, the retrieval process is very similar, that there's something very salient about the onsets of either words or signs. And critically, it wasn't the case that iconic features were more retrieved. So if we analyzed whether the hand shape or the location or the movement was particularly iconic in a sign, that didn't predict what was going to be retrieved. So what does this tell us? Basically, it's evidence for sign language phonology, that there's a level of form that's separate from semantics, and that this fundamental distinction isn't affected by the fact that signs often are iconic. And it supports a lot of linguistic research that really, which I think is a really fundamental discovery, that all human languages develop this level of structure that you can call phonology that's separate from meaning. And for spoken languages, these structures are based on vocal features, so where the tongue is, whether the sound is voiced, the vocal articulators. But for sign language, you have similar structures, but it's based on manual features, so hand configurations, locations, and movements. But linguists are discovering that the constraints, the nature of these forms are very parallel between the two. So we come back to my question, do all human languages represent meaning and form independently? And the answer is yes. So now let me go to the next question. Does the brain distinguish between language and pantomime when they look the same? Now, before I get to this question, though, I think it's important to ask another question because we need to know something just about the basic processing for sign language. So, do we see basic parallels in brain structures that process spoken language and sign language? So are those same areas, key regions involved? And so I want to go through that a little bit. And I'm going to talk about two very famous regions that are known to be critical for spoken language processing, and that's Broca's region, Broca's area. We know it does a lot of things, but it's known for a long time to be key in spoken language production. Okay? Wernicke's area, or this posterior superior temporal cortex, is known to be involved in comprehension of spoken language. And interestingly enough, Broca's area is just in front of, just anterior to, the motor cortex that controls the vocal articulators, the lips, the tongue. So it kind of makes sense that you would have a region involved in speech production near the articulators, the sensory motor control of the speech articulators. For Wernicke's area, it's just behind auditory cortex, which makes sense that an auditory comprehension system or region would be near auditory cortex. But now this raises the question, what about sign languages, right? Because sign languages use the hands as the primary articulators. The hand representation, the sensory motor representation of the hands is much farther up on the motor cortex, not right next to Broca's area. And of course, sign languages are perceived visually. The visual cortex is in the back of the brain. Okay? So does this difference in the input-output system sort of fundamentally kind of reorganize the language systems that within the left hemisphere? Well, here's the answer. If we first look at output, so sign and word production, I'm showing you data from a study that we did that was sort of a meta-analysis looking at studies of sign production and word production and doing what's called a conjunction analysis to see what regions are equally active for both sign and word production. And this was these were picture naming tasks where people would see a picture and have to produce the word or the sign. And what we see is that Broca's area was equally active for both sign and speech production. And this fits with long-standing work looking at sign aphasia, suggesting that you have production problems if you have damage to this area. These data also indicate that really Broca's area is not a speech area, right? So despite the fact that it's right next to the speech motor articulators, and despite the fact that there's really strong connections between Broca's area and auditory cortex, it nonetheless is involved in the production of a visual manual language. Okay? So this is not, it's a language region, not a speech region. Now while I'm on this slide, I just want to point out one other region of activation that was active for both sign and speech, and this is left inferior temporal cortex. And I mention this because this was these were based on picture naming studies, and we're going to see this later. This is a region in sort of the visual stream that's involved in object recognition. Activation here is left lateralized. And the idea is that this particular region mediates between object recognition and lexical retrieval, that is, finding the word that you want to label that picture. And that area is also active for both speech and sign language. Okay, now what about language perception? Again, we find that this Wernicke's area, this posterior superior temporal cortex, is active for comprehending sign language. Of course, sign language is presented visually, and yet we're seeing activation in Wernicke's area in this posterior SDS region. Again, this is telling us that this region is not a speech region. It's not tied to auditory speech processing. And I'll point out one other thing. These two studies, our study here and this study by Petito, actually presented what are called pseudosigns, nonsense signs. They're analogous to nonsense words like garn or blick. So So this activation for those studies wasn't so much comprehending like lexical items, because these forms didn't have meaning, but they were linguistically structured. So they were more active for deaf people watching these, people who know the sign language, than hearing people who didn't know the sign language. For the hearing people, these were just hand movements. For signers, these forms were linguistic objects. They were, even though they didn't have meaning, they were like garn or blick. You recognize those as possible English words. The brain recognized those as possible signs. So you had phonological processing going on in this region that's very close to auditory cortex. The other thing that's worth mentioning with respect to this activation in these sort of auditory regions is we've looked at, we've done structural brain studies of deaf individuals who are born deaf to look at what happens to their auditory cortex. Do we see differences between auditory cortex for people who are born deaf and hearing people? And surprisingly, it turns out that auditory cortex does not atrophy and die in deaf individuals. We looked at two regions. One is Heschel's gyrus. So this is primary auditory cortex, so the first place in the brain that sound reaches to be processed. The size of Heschel's gyrus was not different. It wasn't smaller for deaf individuals. It was the same size for deaf and hearing individuals. And when we looked at what's called the planum temporale, which sometimes is considered to be overlapping with Wernicke's area, we also didn't find any difference in the size of the planum temporale for deaf compared to hearing people. In addition, for both of these structures, they were bigger in the left hemisphere, the language hemisphere, than in the right hemisphere. And so what this is telling us is the reason we were finding bigger planum and Heschel's gyrus in hearing people wasn't because they were processing speech, okay, or because it was something to do with auditory cortex. We find it in deaf people as well. So we still don't know exactly what's underlying this asymmetry. It could be language processing, it could be something else. But it's not related to hearing. This data also fits really nicely with what I just showed you in terms of brain activation, that these sort of auditory regions are activated by visual information for deaf signers. Both sign language and other kinds of visual stimuli activate auditory cortex in these individuals. Okay, so let me come back now to my sort of sub-question. Are the key brain regions critical for sign language as well as spoken language? Here we find the answer is yes. Okay, so now let me ask the question about language and pantomime. And of course, this question arises because, unlike words, signs can look like actions. And so how does the brain tell the difference? Here's examples of what these signs look like. So these are often called handling verbs, because for the kinds of verbs I'm going to be looking at, it's how you would hold or use a particular object, how you would handle it. So here's the ASL sign for scrub, and the ASL sign for drink. Okay, so you can see these sort of show how you hold an object and how you use an object. They look very much like, if you were to pantomime those actions, it might look very much like that. Okay? But if you think about what's involved in a pantomime, it's determined a lot by the properties of the object, right? So if you're going to pantomime drinking from a straw, you might do something like this. Or if you're going to pantomime drinking a shot, you might do something like this. A mug, different. You'll do different pantomimes depending on the object that you're drinking from, right? But the ASL sign for drink means consume a liquid. It doesn't mean drink with a mug or drink with a cup or something like that. And so you can use this sign in all of those different contexts just to mean that liquid was consumed. And the way that it's represented in a signer's brain, at least this is what we hypothesize, is that just like the English word form drink is stored in your lexicon, and when you want to use that, you pull up what those sounds are. For a signer, you have the phonological form of the sign that means consume liquid that you pull up and produce when you're producing the sign. Okay? And so we wanted to know what neural regions underlie these two different activities. How are they similar? How are they different? How do they dissociate? Do they dissociate? Does the brain make a difference? So I've told you about the brain areas that are involved in language production, but I need to tell you something about what the brain areas are for pantomime production. So these are just a couple studies hearing people who were asked to pantomime how you would use different tools. And they looked at what brain areas were involved. They compared it to a sort of complex finger movement task. And what you find is, in particular, left superior parietal cortex, or SPL, superior parietal lobule, is engaged in pantomime production. So this is a region at the top of the brain. Okay? And you don't find language areas involved in pantomime production. So you don't see Broca's area engaged, for example, when you're producing a pantomime. So our hypotheses, given what we know about language and the neural representation for language and for pantomime, was that if these sort of pantomimic signs, these signs like drink or hammer or brush your hair, if they pattern like pantomime, they look very much like pantomime, then we should see greater activation in superior parietal lobule. Okay? On the other hand, if they pantomime like the production of words, we should see activation in Broca's area. The area that's involved in retrieving lexical items. Okay, does everybody get the idea? Okay. So we conducted a PET study. So PET stands for positron emission tomography. Most of you probably are more familiar with fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. PET, they both measure brain function. They both essentially measure blood flow within the brain. So when a brain area is active, blood flows to that area. They do it in a little bit different ways. The reason we use PET is that it's much more forgiving of movement. And we're really interested in sign production. And so this allows us to have signers in the scanner and actually really sign. If anybody's had an MRI, you know that you're told, do not move, lay as still as possible. Here you can move a little bit more. The deaf individuals that we studied were all native signers, so this means that they were born into deaf families. They acquired ASL from birth. This is important because often if we're comparing, we want to kind of compare apples and apples. So hearing people are exposed to their spoken language from birth. We're going to compare deaf individuals who compared to sign language from birth. We asked our participants to do two things, and I'm going to go through the tasks. To either generate a verb, given a picture, or a pantomime. So in the verb generation task, of course, this was only deaf people because we were just interested in sign production, sign verb production. So they were given a picture of a particular object, and they were asked, just produce a verb that goes with that object. Okay? In the pantomime condition, they were shown, again, similar pictures of objects, but now they were asked, generate a pantomime. Show me how you would use this object. And we had both hearing people and deaf people perform that task. And then in all of these imaging tasks, you always have kind of a baseline task that allows you to sort of measure against which you measure activation. Okay? And our task was just to indicate whether a pictured item can be held or not. And I'll show you what that looked like too. All right, so let's just start with our verb generation task. We actually had two types of pictures. One that would, in pre-testing, would elicit these iconic kind of handling verbs, and another set of pictures that would elicit verbs that didn't have these pantomimic qualities. So we could directly compare verbs that were like pantomimes and verbs that weren't. And here's some examples. So here would be verbs that would elicit these handling type iconic verbs. So this is, if you were shown a picture of a pen, you might produce, or people would most likely produce the verb write. Or shown the picture of a hammer, produce the sign to hammer. Okay. And we normed these both with a group of deaf people to make sure that we sort of consistently elicited these verbs. And we also had hearing people judge whether these were really iconic. Could you sort of guess the meaning? And they could guess the meaning. So these really did look very much like pantomimes. Now in our non-pantomimic cases, you would be given an object, but the verb that was produced didn't have this kind of sensory motor iconicity. So here's the verb to measure in ASL. Okay. And this is my personal favorite, the pour syrup or pour salad dressing. This would be the verb associated with syrup. Okay, so not a handling verb. And again, hearing people couldn't guess what the meanings of these signs were. Now for the pantomime generation task, now they were told, show me what you would do with this object. And we showed hearing people also those pictures that we asked signers to generate verbs to, so the picture of the pen and the hammer. We asked hearing people to generate pantomimes to, so we could compare for the same object a verb versus a pantomime. So here are pictures that we asked both deaf people and hearing people to generate pantomimes to. And we also made sure that the pantomimes that were produced didn't look like the verb that would be associated with it. So the signers couldn't kind of cheat and produce a verb. They had to produce a pantomime. So here's a pantomime for just sweeping. Now the ASL sign for sweep looks like this. Okay. Here's a pantomime just for eating with a fork. Now the verb for eat just looks like this, right? But signers, if they're asked to pantomime, produce something like that. Okay. Now our baseline task. So here again you saw pictures, just like we've been seeing all along. But you were asked to just indicate, can you hold that object or not? So if you could, you would do this. And if you couldn't, you would do this. Okay? And the non-manipulable ones, the houses, were just relatively rare. And the idea of this baseline was, one, we could subtract out activation that was just due to seeing an object, a manipulable object. We could subtract out activation that was just partly due to just moving your hands, and we could subtract out activation that was due to sort of just thinking about the manipulability without actually generating a verb or a pantomime. Okay, so here's what we found. This is activation for deaf people producing pantomimes, and what you can see is what we would expect. Left superior parietal activation. It's actually bilateral and pretty extensive for our deaf signers, particularly when you look at the hearing signers who also produced activation in superior parietal cortex. It was more left lateralized. And we think what's going on, why we see this difference just in pantomime production between the deaf and the hearing folks, is the deaf guys are just better at it. So they produced more complex pantomimes. They were similar but more complex. So for example, they might use two hands. So in seeing a spoon, a hearing person might just do kind of a lax little stir like this. A deaf person would show you the cup or the thing and stir, and tended to repeat it as well, whereas hearing people didn't. Their hand shapes were just much crisper than the hand shapes that were produced by the hearing participants. But the key is now what happens when they're producing these verbs that look like pantomimes. And here we find a very different pattern, right? Here what we find is activation in left inferior frontal cortex, in Broca's area, extending into Broca's area, okay? We don't see activation, more activation in superior parietal cortex, okay? It's engaging a language region. What about the hearing guys producing these? They're producing them as gestures. Now we don't see Broca's activation for the hearing people who are producing pantomimes. We see this, again, this superior parietal activation, and it looks just like the activation that I showed you in the previous slide. Okay? So the brain is treating these forms as verbs for the deaf individuals and engaging language regions. Now what about if we think about these two types of verbs, the handling verbs and the non-handling verbs? If handling verbs somehow engaged pantomime regions, we should see more activation in this superior parietal region for those verbs than for the non-pantomimic verbs. But in fact, what we find is no difference. So this is a color palette of activation. So red if we found red areas, it would be regions that were more active for these handling verbs. And if we saw purple ones, it would be more for these verbs. But what you see is a lot of green, right? Which means no difference in activation between those two. So the brain doesn't care that one is iconic and the other isn't. You're just getting language regions engaged. So if we come to my question, does the brain distinguish between pantomime and language when they look the same? Yes. In fact, what we see is that signs engage this left inferior frontal cortex, which we know is engaged or is involved in lexical search and retrieval processes for language production. Pantomimes, on the other hand, engage bilateral superior parietal cortex involved in motor planning and arm control. Now I want to be a little careful here because the claim isn't that the neural systems for sign and pantomime production are completely distinct and non-overlapping. No, these have overlapping neural circuits, so there are cases where sign can engage superior parietal cortex and pantomime may engage inferior frontal. But you see, but they're engaged differentially with different patterns of activation. Okay. So let me go to the last question. And again, this is arising out, all of these questions sort of stem from this fact that you have a different biology for sign language. And this seems to have a particular impact in how sign languages encode information about space, so talking about the locations of objects. So let me tell you what I mean. So if you think about this scene, you think about how you would describe it in English, sort of cup on a table, or if you know another language, you can think about how your language would encode this. And it turns out that most spoken languages use these sort of functional elements or closed class words, grammatical words called prepositions or locative affixes that encode the spatial relationship. So it's on in English, sul in Italian, en in Spanish, and those of you in other languages can kind of think about what word you would use to encode that. For sign languages, it's a little different. What happens is, for sign languages, it's the location of the hands that indicate the location. Okay? So I can indicate on, I can indicate under, I can indicate on the edge of the table, I can indicate next to, floating above, okay? It's where I place my hands in space that's telling you where the object is, not a particular morpheme, or at least that's what our argument is, a particular meaning unit like a preposition. Now, the way that sign languages do this, they also, they have to pick particular hand shapes or hand shape morphemes that indicate the type of object, so curved object or long, thin object, okay? And these are called classifier morphemes because they're somewhat parallel to what's found in some spoken languages, where there's a particular morpheme that indicates the type of object. So this is an example from Diegueño, where this vowel right here indicates that the cutting is being done with a long object, like with a knife. So this verb would mean to cut with a knife. And if you were to put a different morpheme there, to, it would mean to cut with a curved object, like a scythe or scissors. And so both hand shape and these classifier morphemes indicate the type of object that's participating in the predicate, let's say, in the verb. I want to be a little careful because, at least for my linguistics colleagues, there's definitely controversy about whether you should really analyze these as classifier constructions or not. But for my purposes, the main idea is to sort of see the parallel that there are specific hand shapes that you have to use to represent objects in this spatial relationship. And it's sort of parallel to what's going on in some spoken languages with having morphemes that indicate object type. So our question now is, what are the neural consequences of the spatial language system that's found in sign languages? And I should mention that I know of no sign language that works like a spoken language with respect to spatial language. That is, no sign language that uses prepositions or locative affixes as the primary way of describing spatial locations, giving somebody directions, telling someone what your new kitchen is going to look like. Ins and ons and unders are not used. Invented sign languages, where you transfer a spoken language to a sign language, will have these kind of prepositions. But naturally emerging languages that emerge from communities of users do not use that type of system. They use space to indicate spatial relationships. So what does the brain do? So again, we conducted a PET study where we asked participants to do different tasks where we could focus on the expression of space or the expression of objects. So in one case, we asked participants to produce a classifier form indicating where an object was. And the object didn't change. So this would be, a clock in different positions with respect to a table. And so you can see how the signer would indicate these locations. You basically just do a mapping from what you're seeing to signing space. And our hypothesis is that these are not meaning units in the same way that prepositions are, in terms of being retrieved from a stored set in the lexicon. We contrasted that with where we asked participants to produce the classifier hand shapes for a given object. Okay? So now the objects change, but the location doesn't change. So you're really focusing on what's the right hand shape to indicate that object. Okay? So in case you have a sort of general object classifier, long thin classifier. Okay? So now you're really focusing on the object. And then we compared the activation when participants were doing the location expression versus the object expression task. Okay, so what do we find when we look at the brain areas that are really engaged in expressing the location per se? What we see is activation bilaterally in superior parietal cortex. So this is more posterior than the activation that we were looking at for the pantomime production. And it's regions within superior parietal cortex that we know are involved in a number of visual spatial processes. So spatial attention, visual motor transformation. What that means is basically taking visual information in and translating it into sort of a body-centered representation so that you can move your hand towards a particular location in space or towards a particular object. And it's also, we know that parietal cortex is involved in motor control of the hands in space. So our idea is that what's going on is these regions are engaged because you have to produce a more gradient representation of where these locations are. That's going to engage superior parietal cortex. Now this is really quite different from what's found when we ask people to do these similar tasks in spoken languages, where you have to produce a preposition. So in this case, these are data. This is both comprehension and data from comprehension and production tasks. So these are production tasks where people are asked just name the spatial relationship of the red thing, so in or beside or next to, on. This is a comprehension task. The region is not superior parietal cortex. It's farther down. It's in the inferior parietal regions, and it's a region called the supramarginal gyrus. And the hypothesis here is this region here is sort of in what's sometimes called the where pathway, locating where objects are. It's left lateralized. You only see activation in the language hemisphere. And the idea here is that this is involved in retrieving sort of a categorical representation of the semantics of space. So in, on, or sort of categories of spatial relationships. And that's what's being activated in that region, is this mapping between a scene and a categorical representation of the location that then maps onto the linguistic structure, a preposition or a locative affix, for example. That's very different than the neural computation that has to be done for sign language, where you don't have a categorical representation, but a much more gradient representation, where the exact location of your hand in space is critical. Okay, so what about the other thing? What about now we're not looking at location, but we're looking at the object. Now we find language regions engaged. So we find one is this region I was telling you about before, this inferior temporal cortex region. And this is the region that we know is engaged in object analysis, recognizing objects. It's left lateralized, so it mediates between object recognition and retrieval of the correct hand shape, the correct classifier morpheme. We also see Broca's area involved. Again, lexical search and retrieval. You have to pull out the right hand shape. And our idea is that these hand shapes are stored in the lexicon and have to be retrieved, unlike locations or movements, if you're talking about movement through space. And when we asked signers, I'm not showing you this data, but when we asked signers to name these objects, so sign lamp or hammer, these exact same regions are engaged. So Broca's and inferior temporal cortex. So retrieving a classifier hand shape is very much like retrieving the lexical sign. So these are stored in the lexicon. Oh, I guess I jumped ahead of myself. I already told you that part. All right. So if we come back to the question, does the biology of linguistic expression impact the brain bases for spatial language? The answer is yes. So what does this mean? It means that we've got a very interesting effect of biology on the neural computations that have to be done for expressing spatial language. So for sign languages, you have to do this mapping between either the scene you're describing or a mental image into this body-centered representation where the objects map onto hands, locations map onto locations, and you can have more gradient representations. And what we argue is that unlike the hand shapes and the classifier morphemes that you retrieve, these locations and movements are not stored as morphemes. They're sort of produced on the fly as you're describing these relationships. And so they're quite different from prepositions or locative affixes, and they're going to use different brain systems for their production. In particular, what you're going to see is bilateral SPL, superior parietal activation. Now, before I leave you, I want to make sure that, because often you may think, oh, spatial language is really easy in sign language. All you do is put your hands in space and just match things up, right? Well, how many of you are ASL students? We've got a few ASL students, okay. When you hit classifiers, right, not easy to learn. And it's because there's lots of constraints on how these different hand shapes are put together and how you interpret these relationships. So, and I'm just going to give you a few of these constraints. You can get a flavor for what has to go into the grammar, what you have to learn to be able to produce these. So here's an example of indicating the boy in the car. Now, I can sign something that looks like this. Okay. This is the vehicle classifier. This is sort of a seated person. If I do it like this, it means the boy is sitting next to the car. Okay. If I sign it like this, with an arc motion, then I've really told you that the boy got into the car. So even though the end, my hand is in the same position, you have to understand it not as a next to relationship, but as an in relationship. So it's not always completely obvious that just where the hands are indicates the spatial representation. There's constraints on which of these classifier hand shapes you can use, and they are not at all obvious. So indicating a person standing on a surface like the hood of the car. This is a classifier that means upright person. You can mean it for someone walking through the woods or something like that. You cannot, this is weird, okay? Even though it's perfectly makes sense, surface, upright person on it, you have to use what's called a legged classifier, this classifier, to describe that picture. That's something you have to learn. There's constraints on what are called markedness. So this is upright thing, that's a pen, okay? I should tell you that star in linguistic terminology means bad or not good, okay? So for this first one, and also just to make sure you can see, these pens, they're either all upside down or they're all pointing upwards, okay? Now if I do this, okay, this is the unmarked form. It doesn't necessarily mean the pens are upside down or upright. I can either one. But if I did this, okay, that's marked. That has to mean the pens are pointing upwards, because this then is the top of the pen, okay? Not an obvious thing that you would know. You have to learn this, okay? And this is just a handful of these kinds of constraints. So it's a very complex system. Kids take a long time to learn it. I've even talked about perspective. But I wanted to, we were particularly interested in just looking at, okay, let's start with the basics, the very simple, and see what differences we see between spoken and sign languages and what brain regions need to be involved to just do the simple part of placing your hands in space. This requires a lot more work to see what is parsed out for these very complex kinds of constructions. Okay. So, what do I want you to take home with you today? One of the things is that I've shown you two reasons why iconicity this fact that signs often look like what they mean doesn't really alter the fundamental organization of human language or the brain bases. So evidence from tip of the finger suggested that despite the fact that you've got lots of form meaning overlap, there can be retrieved independently in 2 stages. The neuroimaging results comparing sort of signs that look like pantomimes and signs that don't, the brain doesn't care whether it's iconic or not. You get the same left hemisphere language-related regions engaged in their production. Doesn't matter whether they have this mapping between form or meaning. But that said, there's a lot of really interesting work going on right now to explore, well, it doesn't change the fundamental nature of brain organization or language, but do we see an interesting role for iconicity, for example, in acquisition or in processing? And so people are starting to play a little bit. We know there's very interesting constraints on metaphor that have been discovered that are based on whether signs are iconic or not. So there's some interesting things to look at with iconicity, but it doesn't really alter the basic structure of language or the neural systems. We do see differences with respect to spatial language. So there we really do see a different system, both linguistically, with respect to this use of signing space. It comes from the biology. It's very easy to show where my hands are. You can't point with your tongue. You can't see the articulators. So it's not a natural kind of system that emerges for spoken languages. And we see a reflection then in the brain bases for spatial language, differences between sign and spoken language. So I want to thank you. I think it's really, really important to thank the people who participate in our studies, because without their volunteering, the research simply isn't possible. So it's really important to say a big thank you to all of the people who volunteer their time to participate in our studies. Because I have to thank my funding agencies, and I have to thank the colleagues in particular from UCSD, Iowa, USC, University of Washington, who collaborated on the projects that I talked about today. Now, before I move on to questions, I couldn't resist at least letting you know some of the other things that are going on in the lab, just in case there's students who are interested in these projects or colleagues who might be interested. So one domain that I haven't talked at all about today, but that Steve mentioned, was this notion of bimodal bilingualism. What does that mean? Basically, it's bilinguals whose languages are in 2 different modalities, a visual manual modality and an auditory vocal modality, right? We contrast that with what we sometimes call unimodal bilinguals. That is, most studies of bilinguals have been done on people who know 2 spoken languages. And our question is, how does this different nature of bilingualism change things? How are bilinguals different from monolinguals? And is there something special about being a bimodal bilingual? So for example, we've already shown previously that bilinguals in a sign language have certain enhanced face processing abilities. They have certain superior abilities and certain mental imagery abilities. We also see parallels between bimodal and unimodal bilinguals. So one of the things that's been shown over and over again is that if you're bilingual, you can't really suppress your other language. It's always on. Anybody who out there is bilingual, you might sort of have this sense, right? It's always kind of on there. And it's turning out that bilinguals don't look like monolinguals. Their other language can sort of subtly impact language processing of the language that they're not actually speaking. We find a really cool effect of this for bimodal bilinguals. And this is in their co-speech gesture. So those of you guys who are sign language signers or have taken sign languages classes, you can sort of think about if you have experienced this yourself. Once you learn a sign language, and now you're interacting with somebody who doesn't know sign language at all, you tend to gesture a little bit more, right? And also, surprisingly, sometimes you'll produce an ASL sign. And of course, the person doesn't know the ASL at all. But it's kind of that language is there, and it just kind of comes out in this way that we don't see for spoken language. Because you can't just sort of produce a Spanish word to somebody who doesn't know Spanish, right? Everything's going to break down. But you can for signs. So we see this really interesting influence. The other area that we're starting to really look at now is reading in the deaf brain. So we know for hearing readers, it turns out that Phonological ability, so being able to map sound to print, is really critical to language acquisition and literacy. But it's turning out that this phonological decoding or phonological awareness abilities is actually not that predictive of how well a deaf individual will read. And so what we're doing is exploring what alternative paths to literacy there might be for deaf individuals by first sort of mapping the neural circuits for very skilled deaf readers who may not have great phonological awareness skills but are reading at college level. Does the brain arrive at the same neural solution that hearing people do? And we're also interested in looking at the role that fingerspelling might play in supporting reading acquisition and reading in general. And I'll just end by acknowledging my fabulous lab. I mean, we have such a terrific group of students and researchers and postdocs in this lab. I'm really blessed to work with a fantastic group of people. So I have to end by thanking them. And then I'll move to taking your questions.
We're going to have a reception afterwards. You're going to be able to spend 20 minutes. So that's the good news. And so a couple of things before we finish. Obviously, I was remiss in my duties when I started in that I didn't acknowledge the parents of Karen and her husband, and I wanted to do that. I want to thank you guys for coming and helping us honor her. The other reason I mentioned it is that you can tell when a speaker thinks it's important is when they invite their parents, and depending on the week, their husband. So what I'd like to also just be sure to highlight is that, San Diego State takes great pride in the teacher-scholar model. But that only has meaning if the word scholar rises to the same level as teacher. And when the peers, the other faculty selected Karen, what they were saying is that she represents the kind of scholar we value, that we want her to represent us and our university with the selection process. And so with that, I'd like to present her with a plaque that she can fight with the parents with.
Thank you.
2013 Albert Jackson.
All right, thank you.